Dang it. Oh no. Come on in. Because now it's time to learn, to cook, to taste. Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of To Taste. I'm Cody Reiss. I'm the host of this podcast, and nice to meet you, first of all. To Taste is a podcast, honestly, if I'm going to be real with you, To Taste is a podcast where every episode is about a different food. And in every episode, I talk to an expert on that food, and I try to dive as deep as possible and understand everything that they understand about that food, trying to understand their thought process, their inflection points, what knowledge they're drawing on when they make that food. And the whole goal is to explore the idea of intuitive cooking. What does it mean to cook without a recipe? How do you get to the place where you can step into the kitchen and improvise or cook something to your own taste without having to go back and forth with the recipe, measuring ingredients, blah, 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 blah. So that's the journey that we're going to be on together. Today's episode is about grilled cheese. Our guest is the wonderful, amazing food writer, Lex Weibel, who I'm a huge fan of. And she's just going to walk us through everything that she thinks about when she's making a grilled cheese. And we're also going to talk a bit about what it means to be an intuitive cook and how you get better at that. I'm so excited that you're here. I'm very grateful that you would listen to a podcast. It's kind of long. And I'm also just learning how to edit podcasts. And I have a pretty slow computer. So you're gonna have to bear with me, and it's only gonna get better, is what people keep telling me. And then again, if you're out there and you're a podcast editor and you want to get in on the ground floor of something that's obviously going to be incredibly awesome, let me know. Anyways, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And here's my conversation with Lex. You chose grilled cheese as your topic. And so I guess my first question is, why did you choose grilled cheese?
Good question. I feel like it is just one of the go-to things that I cook quite frequently. Early morning, late afternoon, snack, late night cooking. It's just such a basic staple in the way that I cook, largely probably because it relies upon ingredients that I'm always going to have on hand. Those ingredients being fat, bread, and cheese. But also, I think I get really excited about the concept of a simple recipe that actually can have very different results based on kind of just small changes, whether it's cooking with a different fat, cooking what type of vessel, how you're cooking it. And I think for me, what I like about it is just the concept of kind of mastery of a intuitive cooking approach. And I will admit that is something that was not, did not come intuitively to me. And it is something that I think is a skill that I have worked at over an extended period of time, especially since I am a person who was not a bold cook, was not raised in a household where people really knew how to cook and could throw things together and could instruct me how and why they were doing the things that they were doing. And I guess that probably leads to me perhaps introducing myself and explaining what I do for a living, which is I'm a staff editor at NYT Cooking at the New York Times food section. And I started as a cook who really very much relied on recipes. And now I think that after years of working as a recipe editor, I also went to culinary school. I've cooked in test kitchens and restaurant spaces, and gained the confidence and expertise to become more of an intuitive cook. But it wasn't initially second nature to me. And so something as simple as a grilled cheese feels quite luxurious and lovely, knowing that I have the confidence to cook it the way I like it.
What to you is the ideal grilled cheese?
I think that I have somewhat strong feelings on that, but it also varies based on the contents of my fridge and what I have available. I think, it's essentially three things. So it's fat, whether that's butter or olive oil or even mayonnaise or a combination of each of those, or bread. I think that it's if you have a nice loaf of bread, that's wonderful, but you don't want it to tear open the roof of your mouth. So there's
Right.
like a certain happy sweet spot between, you know, uh, basic sandwich bread and something a little fancier. Sorry, that's my cat.
That's okay.
And then the cheese, usually the main thing that matters is meltability. So, it's not necessarily what's the best cheese. A nice triple creme brie would be a mess in a grilled cheese because it's just gonna run all over your pan.
Mm.
You want something that has a decent meltability, and I think that going back to the expectations for a grilled cheese, I think about the grilled cheese of my childhood, which was basic sandwich bread, probably margarine, most likely margarine, and Kraft cheese. And the reality is, I still occasionally dig Kraft cheese for that, just because it has really good meltability, meaning it will melt quickly and evenly without just gushing out of your sandwich when you eat it. And it kind of scratches that nostalgic itch that I often want with a grilled cheese, because ultimately grilled cheese is comfort food. But I usually have a decent cheddar or two in my fridge that I'll happily pull out. I recently randomly had some Gouda, and a Gouda grilled cheese is quite nice with
Mm.
a tomato soup.
Mm.
Really, it's just the right combination of your fat, your bread, and your cheese.
Let's say you're about to have your last meal, and you have an infinite pantry of like every kind of bread you could possibly choose from, every kind of fat you could choose from, every cheese you could choose from, whatever pan you want, oven, whatever you want. You can, and it's the task is like make your perfect grilled cheese basically before you leave this earth, I guess
Okay,
is the
okay.
idea. So what are you grabbing and how are you making it? Like walk me through the steps.
Well, I think that is tricky because I
It
I I
depends on your
think
mood.
well, yeah, I mean a grilled cheese is it is super satisfying and super comforting. But I think by nature I don't want it to be too fancy or too fussy. Occasionally I've added, charcuterie, like thinly sliced charcuterie in it. I like adding sautéed kale or other greens to kind of balance out the fat, the richness of it.
Mm.
But basic grilled cheese, I'm using equal parts butter and olive oil in a cast iron skillet.
Mm.
I think equal parts butter and olive oil do wonderful things, both for their purpose and flavor. So butter has a tendency to burn. Adding a little bit of olive oil to it kind of prevents that hazard of
Mm.
cooking grilled cheese. And then I think the flavor just makes sense that way. The bread, I will be using a nice loaf of sourdough, or something that has a little bit of heft to it and a little bit of flavor. And then the cheese I use grated. I would go with a grated cheddar,
Mm.
coarsely grated, not
Mm.
sliced. I think when you grate it coarsely, it's gonna melt more easily.
Mm.
And then I think, I was thinking about the steps of a grilled cheese. And it's interesting when you share basic information, it is interpreted in so many different ways
Mm.
by someone who is a pretty knowledgeable cook versus a cook who doesn't necessarily know too much about cooking. So I can think about the details that, like, when I add my fat to the pan, I'm going to let the butter melt into the olive oil. I'm going to wait until the pan tells me that it's ready. And the
Uh,
pan will audibly sizzle, which is a fun thing to look out for if you know to
mm.
look out for it.
Mm. Before
Um,
you put the bread in, you mean?
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
And then, I think some people might slather their fat on their bread, but I've never been afraid of extra fat. So I usually kind of have a nice little pool of the olive oil and butter in the skillet.
Mm.
And then I'll just set down my two pieces of bread, which I think actually is, in my mind, the easiest way to do it, because the bread will just kind of absorb on the two sides that you want it to absorb fat. And then I'm sprinkling cheese on one side of them. I'm flipping the other piece over. And then I actually set a lid on top of my grilled cheese, but I intentionally make sure that lid is slightly smaller than the surface area of my grilled cheese. And I think what that does is it weighs it down a little bit so that the bottom of the grilled cheese sandwich is going to caramelize nicely, because it will have more surface area directly connecting to the fat in the pan.
Mm.
It's also going to help it cook more evenly by encouraging the cheese to melt a little bit faster because it's slightly steaming. Um, without essentially grilled cheese is all about timing too. So really you want the bread to caramelize in just the right amount of time that the cheese melts on the inside. Because if you're not doing it, if you're not figuring out your timing appropriately, it's going to blacken too much on the outside and then the cheese is not melted, and that's a big disappointment. And then I flip it once it's caramelized on the bottom and then cook it until caramelized on the other side. And even, just small details about how are you serving your sandwich. If I'm feeling fancy and I'm serving it with a salad, I might cut it crosswise on a slight angle, so it kind of has these like nice little points, and then I can perch one on top of the other, so it's got a little height. Or I might, if I'm feeling snacky, I might cut my grilled cheese into 4 soldiers and think about Black Flag and serve it with like a mayonnaise dip or something.
Wow. Okay, I've got a million questions already. Talk to me about the loaves that you wouldn't use personally for a grilled cheese and why, maybe.
Honestly, any bread will work in your grilled cheese. Like basic Wonder sandwich bread is going to be great in your grilled cheese. If you caramelize it a little bit, it's going to be softer. That's fine. A fancy loaf of bread that has like wonderful rye flavor or whatever it may be also will be great, as long as you don't overcook it and let it caramelize too much. I'm sure people might disagree with me, but I don't think the bread choice really is going to massively make or break your grilled cheese. Like, it's going to be great with subpar bread, and it's going to be great with fancy bread. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, let's wind back in the process here. You are stepping into your kitchen to make a grilled cheese.
Yeah.
What's the first thing that you do?
I'm reaching for my cheese. I'm seeing what cheese I have.
Cheese, okay.
That is usually probably the place where I have the most room for choice, I suppose, because I usually have a few different cheeses on hand. And I'll see what I have, and then I'll decide from there. Because, sometimes I might, depending on what cheese I'm using, I might want to swipe. Now I'm just complicating things, but I might want to swipe some mustard on my bread, on the inside of the bread before I cook it. I actually made a grilled cheese earlier today because I was thinking about it. And I put a little bit of mustard on the bread. I had some nice seaside cheddar, which is like a nice, somewhat aged cheddar that has a pretty robust flavor and some bite, if you will.
Right.
And then after I'd thrown together my grilled cheese, I realized I wanted a dip for it. So I took some mayonnaise and swirled in a little bit of chili crisp, because I've been eating a lot of holiday food, and I wanted like a little heat to kind of make up for the richness of the grilled cheese.
Do you think it's helpful to go nitty gritty into like your thought process of like the order of operations that you're going through when you're making a grilled cheese? Like, do you think that is helpful for people to hear, or is that like too granular?
I mean, that might be a little granular, just because I think I would think that, a grilled cheese is something that can be built based on what you have. So whatever bread you have, whatever cheese you have, as long as your cheese has a decent meltability. So you don't want to use a super fatty cheese that runs quite a bit when it melts, meaning a cheese like a brie or a triple creme or a cream cheese. Those just essentially liquefy when they are exposed to heat. You don't want to use a very dry aged cheese like a Parmesan, because they just don't melt so well, and they lack that kind of moisture richness that something in the middle has, such as sliced Kraft American cheese if you're not feeling fancy, or cheddar, Gouda, any kind of medium textured cheese that grates into something that is somewhat soft.
Dare I say provolone, mozzarella?
Oh yeah. Yes, all of those things are great. Yeah.
So we're kind of in the semi hard world. Like, you probably still want to use like a super aged cheddar that might not melt as well, but like, I imagine like all the Swiss cheeses probably would be really good. Like,
yeah, semi firm cheese.
Yes. Okay. That sounds good. And stop me if I say something wrong. You've got a cast iron going. It's got oil and butter in it. You might have already grated your cheese, which you grate coarsely. Once the oil sizzles, you have 2 pieces of sourdough. It could be fancy or bagged, sliced not so thin that it'll become brittle, and not too thick that it'll be difficult to eat. And you put them down in the oil and the fat. Do you do a flipsy-daisy, or you just put them down?
No need to flip them. Just put them down so that one side on each piece of bread is absorbing the fat.
Okay, great. And then you move them around a little bit, maybe to make sure that the coverage is good. Yeah. And then you've got a little pile of cheese that you've grated coarsely,
Yep.
and you pick up that pile
Mm-hmm.
and you sprinkle it onto the cheese carefully so none gets on the pan and burns
In an even layer on one of the pieces of bread.
on one of the pieces of
And
bread.
I don't
Okay.
mind if it can, a little bit it can trickle over the sides because it's going to form that like nice little frico as the cheese is going to crisp up in the pan. But 95% of it should just stay on the bread. And then once I've kind of dispersed that in an even layer, I'm flipping over the other piece of bread with the fat side up, which is essentially forming the sandwich. And then I'm putting
You're flipping it on. You're turning it into
to
the
cover
lid
the
of the
cheese.
sandwich.
I'm
Okay,
turning
got
it into a sandwich by taking these two pieces of bread, flipping one that doesn't have cheese on it
Right.
onto the one that has cheese on it.
Revolutionizing the sandwich.
Yeah.
What's
And I realize I'm on a podcast and I'm using my hands to show you how I'm flipping the bread.
I've been using my hands too. So what's the ratio of bread to cheese to bread for you?
I would say it is roughly, just to keep it nice and formulaic, it's like 1 part cheese and 2 parts bread. It's a sandwich after all.
Right. When you say 2 parts bread, it's 2 slices of bread and 1 part
Yeah.
cheese. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you would say, I know this is probably too fine grained, but the amount of cheese is like the thickness of 1 slice. Would that be right then?
I mean, it's slightly thinner than that. But
Right.
yeah, we could go with like slightly thinner than the thickness of 1 slice of bread. And I
Cool.
forgot to tell you that I'm also putting salt and pepper on my cheese, which
Oh.
is maybe polarizing and maybe unnecessary, but I do like pepper. And I know most cheese has a decent amount of salt in it, but I like a lot of salt. So I season things a lot. I think that's also a conversation that I have a lot with people about cooking, and a very basic suggestion of what makes your home cooking different than a lot of restaurant dishes is a hefty dose of salt and pepper.
Totally. Yeah, definitely. And fat.
And fat, yeah.
Okay, so I actually think, believe it or not, as simple as this whole thing is, I think I misunderstood you at first, where I was thinking you were toasting it open face, but it sounds like what's actually happening is
Just coating it in the fat.
It's a quick thing. So it gets
Yeah.
oil, the cheese goes in, you flip it, the top has fat on it, but it is not in any way toasted.
Correct.
Okay. Then you take a lid that is smaller than
The surface area of the bread.
that's smaller than the surface area of the bread.
Mm-hmm.
So the lid is sitting on top of the bread.
Yeah. I'm usually using a lid from a small saucepan.
Okay.
And so it is just kind of it's retaining a little bit of heat.
Mm-hmm.
So as you said, the idea of like cooking on a skillet, the heat is coming up. That means
Right.
it's warming up the bottom more than it's warming the top. And then putting a lid on it does a few different things. One being retains a little bit more heat so that the entire sandwich is warming up rather than just the point of contact at the bottom. But it also, I think, presses the sandwich ever so slightly. You don't need to smush it, but it helps, I think, the base of the bread make contact with the skillet so that it caramelizes nicely.
Okay.
And again, when you think about intuitive cooking or not, like I think if you were to take rather than a small lid, and if you were to cover it with a large lid, it would be steaming in a way that
Right.
would cause liquid to drip down from the top of it, which would prevent the bottom of your grilled cheese from properly caramelizing.
Right.
The results are so different. It is interesting to think about a recipe or a method has so much room for error,
Right. Totally. Yeah. And I think you said this earlier, but like everyone's stove is different. Everyone's idea of like thickness is different. If they don't have like a ruler, everyone's idea of like what coarseness of a like cheese is.
Also, even just like how much you're toasting your bread. I know lots of people who love burnt toast because they grew up eating burnt toast. And then,
Totally.
yeah, there's a lot of preference involved there too.
What temperature is the heat at for you, and or what? How high is the stove? And is there like an aural sound that you relate to cooking? Because I think like I kind of mentioned earlier, like I think grilled cheese is this like heat balance thing, especially if you're like using like thick slices of cheddar cheese because you didn't have a grater on you.
Yeah.
It's a balancing act of like how done and like browned the bread is with the insides melting,
Yeah.
do you have a like is it like how do you think about that? I guess is the
I think it
question.
should be pretty quick. It's medium high, but I also think about, as much as we're talking about intuitive cooking and a level of like culinary expertise or whatnot,
Uh-huh.
like what is also cool about cooking is that it is intuitive that like you see something burning and you think this should not be burning. What can I do to change it? And you can take the temperature down, you
Right.
know? So yes, like it's a the perfect grilled cheese. It is caramelizing at the exact rate that the cheese melts at the center of it. But
Right.
like also, you can, if it's cooking too fast, you reduce the temperature. If it has browned too quickly, I don't know, serve it with some mayonnaise to uh, counteract the fact that it's like a little bit drier.
Right. I mean, it's funny because like it's burning, turn down the heat seems so obvious, but like
Mhm.
it's not. It's not always like if and that like the recipe doesn't say that, right? It's like that's another thing that's like inherent in a recipe where it's like it's relying on people to know that. I don't know. I was I think a pretty bad line cook, and I
Mhm.
like the way that we would like pick up vegetables on the line was like the vegetables were already blanched, and you're basically like sizzling garlic and tossing the vegetables just to
Mhm.
heat through.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
was always burning garlic, just like
Mhm.
every other fire it seemed like. And
Mhm.
then I then like like we also had a pot for a pasta of water for pasta, and I learned from a coworker to just like take a little ladle of water when the garlic's burning and splash
Slow
it in
things
there.
down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
slow things down. And it's like those are other. That's a trick that I wouldn't. I is like so obvious to me that I think most home cooks I didn't have before I worked in a restaurant.
I mean, even just the idea of like what an incredible ingredient water is, right?
Yeah.
Like you can use it to bring down the temperature really quickly. You can, use ice to chill things as needed. You can even use like I had a conversation with Brooks from Superiority Burger about I did a story on I developed a recipe for NYT Cooking on a vegan cacio e pepe,
Mm,
and it enraged many people who argued that cacio e pepe means cheese and pepper, and it cannot be cacio e pepe without cheese.
mm.
And they're not wrong if you are truly considering a dish that is cheese and pepper.
Right.
But I put a lot of thought and research into cacio e pepe, and like I think a lot of it really comes down to like the salinity, like salt and pepper.
Mm,
And you can get salinity in different ways than just strictly a salty cheese. But point being, I had a conversation with Brooks about how like so many people think that if you're eating a carbonara or a cacio e pepe or like a cream or even a chickpea based pasta that is creamy and it sits for a minute and it gets sticky, people think that you want to add more fat to it to make it luscious again.
mm,
But really, it's actually water. Like
mm.
water is such a cool ingredient. Like next time one of your pastas, your cheesy pastas gets a little bit dry, use a little bit of, if you have the pasta cooking water, great. If not, just a little bit of water, it's going to
Totally.
re-emulsify it.
Yeah. And
And
like
and again, these things like they come from like tips from people and things that you read and things that you see people do, and really just like remembering things and being observant.
I know it's so tough. Like I think like maybe the tragedy of my like creative educational trajectory is like I want to create something that I want to like figure out the perfect way to like teach people the shortcuts and these little things that are all like inside your brain.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it might not be possible. It might just be like you have to be you have to be interested in it, and you have to be doing your own research, and you have to be really like have the motivation to be perceptive. I don't know.
But I feel like
And
I don't know. I think that there are just so many entry points to like what is good cooking, like
yeah.
what is a good dish. I mean, there are a gazillion different definitions of it, but like I don't know. Arguably, a good dish is something that is feeding you and you're cooking with what you have. Like people have so many different qualifications for what is a good dish. Like the idea of being able to just take a box of Kraft mac and cheese and
Yeah.
make yourself food in 10 minutes. And like sometimes I've gotten deeper satisfaction from that than like a painstaking recipe that has cost me time and money and effort.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I have a couple more grilled cheese questions and then a couple more cooking questions, if that's cool. If
Yeah.
time wise. I think the last two grilled cheese questions I have, oh God, there might be three. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but like the cut. If you have any thoughts about like how to cut it, it sounded like you were like kind of based on your feeling. Or like you said soldiers, which I liked. I like the soldiers were the soldiers like long guys, or are they trying?
No, they're short guys. Like, oh, right. You're saying the cut of the grilled cheese.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's such a restauranty thing to like take a look at your. Most of the time that I'm making grilled cheese, I'm using bread that is oval shaped as opposed to like a small square that is
right.
typical sandwich bread. If I'm serving typical sandwich bread, that's just going to be cut crosswise into like two nice melty triangles,
Mm,
which again you can look at it visually and say like, oh, I want two triangles rather than two rectangles, or you can think about like, I want them to, I want to cut one tip to the opposite corner so that
right,
there's
right.
a longer line of melted
Mm,
cheese oozing out in the middle.
mm,
But it doesn't always have to be that like fancy or fussy. You know what I mean? Like
totally.
instinct. But yeah, I if I'm serving my grilled cheese with a salad, I'm usually cutting it in half crosswise, meaning like across the shortest portion rather than lengthwise, and then
Mm,
at a slight angle. So I have like kind of like two jaunty little points where I can take one point from one sandwich and kind of position it on top of another point so that there's a little bit of height
a little
involved.
power.
Yeah, make it a
Yes.
little lively. But if I'm just cooking for myself, I'm probably cutting it into four soldiers, like finger sized, so that I can dip them in a condiment, which is usually mayonnaise and some other surprise ingredient,
Mm, mm,
like mustard or chili crisp or hot sauce
mm,
for the most part.
mm. I love that.
I like
I
to dip.
don't, yeah, I don't really think about dip with, I
Mhm.
think when I think dip and I think grilled cheese, I think tomato soup and I think yuck personally,
Mhm.
but I like the idea of mayo. That sounds awesome. I love mayonnaise. I guess that kind of brings tomato soup. Like, do you like tomato soup and grilled cheese
Oh, I
together?
do, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that also stems from having a can of Campbell's soup around as a kid and
Mm,
just that combination. But I like being able to dip a soup, a grilled cheese in soup and have it soften and
mm,
kind of have that behavior of being able to have different experiences with different bites. So a bite
right.
of your soup, a bite of your grilled cheese, a bite of your grilled cheese dipped into your soup, you know,
I
makes a
like that.
difference.
I get that. That's actually like, I think romantic in its own way. And I hadn't really thought about that. Like, I never really got it, but that makes sense. I get why you would want to like, I love eating burritos and I love eating like, I feel like there's this rhythm of like saucing each bite and like looking
Mhm,
at the
mhm.
bite and being like, how saucy is this already? How much sauce do
Yeah.
I have left? Like, I like that. I get that.
I don't have a lot of good burritos in my life, but I definitely love Taco Bell. And the joy of like, oh, am I gonna put some like Diablo sauce on this one, or is it just gonna be
Right.
like a little mild bite, or like maybe I'm gonna put some extra nacho cheese on this one, and
Right. It's
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 fun.
like rolling up the sauce packet to get every last little drip out of it. 'Cause there's
Yeah,
only
but
like
like
a
the DIY aspect of like customizing your food, I think is quite underrated and quite special.
yes, I agree. Okay, what about stuff inside of grilled cheese? Like, is there a point when like it stops being a grilled cheese? How do you think about what you put in? Because I'm thinking like I put tuna salad in a grilled cheese, I made a tuna melt. It's no longer
That
really
is a
grilled
tuna melt, yeah.
cheese, you know?
You're right, that's a tuna melt.
So, so like, how do you like? Do you often put stuff in there? Like, I know you mentioned charcuterie before. You
Yeah.
mentioned like greens.
Yes and no. It depends on, I mean, I think the most common way that I'm eating a grilled cheese is with a salad. And the salad is going to be very simple and have greens, but also a very acidic dressing that's gonna
Mm,
kind of enliven my taste buds after I've had something rich and salty and cheesy. But I think that I think that a grilled cheese is wonderful. Just like fried rice, I make both of those things very commonly in my house,
mm,
and they are just very welcoming homes to any type of leftovers. So, like, if I have a cooked vegetable, like I will literally chop up a cooked vegetable, like broccoli, carrots, whatever, and throw it in my grilled cheese. If I
mm,
have a pickled vegetable I put kimchi in grilled cheese quite a bit. It welcomes almost anything. I'll
mm,
saute kale with a little bit of garlic. Maybe put a little bit of lemon on that and put that in my grilled cheese as well. Like
Mm.
there's nothing that doesn't go in grilled cheese unless it overpowers the grilled cheese or cannot be eaten comfortably in a bite. Like
Mm.
you don't want to bite into you don't want to you wouldn't put a slice of bacon in your grilled cheese because you're going to bite into it and the bacon's just going to be pulled
Pull
out and
out,
it's going
right?
to change the whole experience.
Yes, that makes sense. Okay, what about any like common mistakes that you think people make with grilled cheese and how to avoid them? We talked about burning a little bit. Is there any other like pitfalls of like the grilled cheese that you think might be easily avoidable?
No, you know what? Honestly, I'm not going to be a snob here, and I'm going to say whatever grilled cheese you want to make is going to be delicious for you. And I know that's not the answer that you want, and it should be wiser and have tips. But like, if you are you're mixing your shredded cheddar with like some nice Gouda or a little bit of Parm, or you want to add like something fancy to your grilled cheese, that's fine too. Like it's the reason why grilled cheese is so good is that like you kind of can't mess it up, like it is so simple and you can make a really good one, but like just like a slice of pizza, even if it's not the best one, it's gonna hit the spot still.
Today's episode of To Taste is brought to you by hamburgers and hot dogs. No, I'm just joking. We actually don't have a sponsor, obviously, because this is the first episode. But if you work for someone that likes, that you would like me to be talking about you right now when I'm talking about basically nothing, please do let me know. I don't care if it's ExxonMobil or Lockheed Martin. As long as you're a company or corporation, we'd love to hear from you. So let us know. And also, this is a nice little segue because at this point, we go from talking about grilled cheese to kind of talking about cooking in general. So let's dive back into our conversation with Lex.
Okay, the reason I was like, I wanted to like was go granular with your order of operations is partially because I think that order of operations is a helpful lesson for home cooks to learn that
1000%.
I think you learn really well in a restaurant because there's not that much time and there's a lot to do. And it makes me think of like, when I'm at home and I'm going to make coffee in the morning when I wake up, like the water gets filled up, the water goes on, the stove turns on, I go do whatever I need to do in the bathroom, I come back, it's like, it's kind of fine, like thinking about the most logical way to kind of like move through a task where like,
Fair.
so in my mind, when I'm thinking about like, I wouldn't probably think about this actually when I was cooking a grilled cheese at home, but I'm thinking like cast iron goes on, oil goes in, it goes on, the stove goes on, you go to the fridge, you find your cheese, you grab your butter at the same time, you
Yep.
come back, you slice your butter, you put it in, that's melting, you start grating your cheese. Shit, I forgot the bread, you go get your bread. Like, is this ringing a bell with you? Is this?
Yeah, of course,
Yeah,
of course.
okay.
And I will say, again, I have not historically been a cook who respects mise en place. And that was probably the cause of most of the errors that I would make in cooking. Because if you don't have all of your ingredients set up for the most part, the timing that a recipe creates will not work well with your approach. Meaning, most recipes either integrate some of the prep, if that makes sense for the cadence of the recipe, or they expect you to have all of your prep done before you start cooking.
Right.
And typically, if all of your prep is done before you start cooking, following the recipe should be a very easy path. But of course, that's not how all of us cook at home. Like I will look at a recipe and say, let me get my oil and butter warming up in the skillet. In that time, I know it doesn't take me long to grate my cheese, so I'll grate my cheese, get the bread in the pan, add the cheese to it. But again, I think that timing depends on your comfort level in the kitchen, your expertise, how speedy you are, etc.
Totally. Just for anyone that might end up listening to this that doesn't know what mise en place means, can you give a little like
Yes,
a little
that is
explanation?
mise en place is a French term for essentially putting things in place. And I would argue now, even though I did not always know this, and I certainly did not respect this in my earlier years of cooking, the idea of having all of your ingredients laid out kind of gets you set up to cook in a way that is more organized and logical and clean. And of course, that is a absolute staple in restaurant kitchens, but not necessarily home kitchens. And I say this meaning if I'm cooking in a test kitchen, if I'm cooking on camera for NYT Cooking, I have a very organized workspace. Sometimes if I'm cooking at home and I have a 3-year-old maniac running around, my mise en place is a very different story, and I might just be kind of discarding things as I'm chopping and moving them over, and it's not as organized as it should be, but that's also life.
Right. And I think that's probably how most people are. It's definitely how I am. And I guess like that makes me think like it's interesting because like when you watch like Emerald Lagasse or like Rachel Ray, I know these are old examples, but that's like they're like, and then you just go in with like this much onion and this much, and they have it all in these little glass. I mean, basically every food video, often like at least on like big glossy video, is like all the mise en place is done, and it's like, yeah, cooking's not hard when it's like, yeah, I've got a cup, I've got all these things perfectly measured out already.
Yeah.
And it to me, it makes cooking feel a little unrelatable. And I think like I also very, very rarely at home get all my mise en place. I never cook recipes. Like,
Yeah.
I'll look at recipes and I'll look at a few of them and I'll be like, okay, what's going on here? What's the like kind of abstract things from it and be like, what are they doing? What's the goal and what they're doing? And I'm just going to do that, which I think is like, as someone that wants to be good at cooking, a little lazy. And I do the same thing with music. I don't learn things like, perfectly by the like note. But I had a thought when you were talking. Oh, go ahead, please.
I would actually argue for you to say that that's a little bit lazy. I would argue that you have a decent amount of confidence and expertise to be able to read a recipe and extract that information. And I say this because I think about the way that I started cooking. So I worked for Rachel Ray actually for years as well before I was at the Times. But I had always been interested in cooking. I came from a household where my mom followed recipes to a T, did not deviate from them, did not very much kind of memorize or learn to cook things by heart. And I ended up really spending a lot of time cooking in my early 20s, at a point in which I had gone through a breakup and just wanted to have friends over all the time and wanted to cook for friends and nurture myself, as cheesy as that sounds. And I was obsessed with, I didn't have much of a budget to cook. And I really liked the idea of cooking the same thing over and over again to figure it out in that sense, similarly to grilled cheese. But I started with soup. And so because I didn't have enough knowledge to look at a recipe and extract that information of like, oh, they're using, they're adding red wine vinegar to this black bean soup. What does that do? I couldn't figure that out in my head. So I would literally regularly make 3 different soup recipes of the same soup. So like 3 black bean soup recipes or 3 tomato soup recipes or 3 potato soup recipes, and then have friends over and kind of compare all 3 and figure out what I liked from each of them, from actually going through the labor and effort to cook all of these things. Now I can look at a recipe and say, oh, that's really interesting. They're adding acidity to this dish that I wouldn't expect. I should try that. But it took a long time for me to figure that out. And so I started exploring recipes by literally granularly kind of cooking 3 dishes of the same thing and comparing and contrasting. And then I later decided to go to culinary school, and that gave me, significant foundational knowledge. And then, of course, today as a editor at NYT Cooking, I read recipes every single day and am not only absorbing, I think, information from each of them, but also just looking at a recipe, and I can automatically look at something and say, oh, you've forgotten to add the cook time or a doneness cue or this other tidbit of information that translates a recipe from a professional cook to success in a home kitchen by someone who might not have such expertise.
Yes, totally. Wow, you're doing like intuitive cooking homework. I can't believe you made 3 different soups of like different recipes. It's crazy. I think that's the reason why I'm like, why I say lazy is a little bit like, by following those recipes to a T, you get three very like different things to look at and compare and contrast. And I think like not, I don't know, me cooking from my gut, I have fallen in my same ruts of like, I always use this vinegar, or I always season things this much or at this point, or like I always like, you know, when I'm cooking my onions as a base, like they always are like a little brown on the outside and a little soft in the middle. And so I think there's something about like following a recipe that could be nice because, you know, if I followed an exact recipe, you understand how the things you start with and the process you use can get to the result that you want. And it kind of opens up more possibilities for how you can use your skills a little bit.
I also think for non-fledgling cooks, like, you know, even chefs, like recipe developers, cookbook authors, I actually think that following a recipe is a very good practice to do on occasion, not necessarily all the time, but I find myself intuitively reading a recipe and thinking to myself, I would not be adding that herb at that stage. I think it would I would use this fresh cilantro at the end of the recipe. Or, oh, that's interesting. They're cutting this vegetable so much larger. I would think that you'd want to cut it smaller so that it cooks until it's this tender in that amount of time. And what is really cool about following a recipe is that occasionally you try something different that does not match your practice or your habits or your expectation, and then you learn something new or realize a different way kind of works better. Like I test a lot of recipes for NYT Cooking, and I am forced to put myself in the shoes of another cook when I do that, because the idea is occasionally I can troubleshoot and I can look at something and say, is that really the right temperature for this? Or potentially see an issue that I will discuss with the recipe developer on the front end before testing. But for the most part, I'm putting myself in their shoes and I'm testing the recipe as it's written verbatim to find out how it works. And occasionally it's really nice to experience someone else's palate and expertise and find a different result that's better. So like I just tested a recipe from a really talented, really wonderful, smart writer and recipe developer, Ifra Ahmed. And she's done a lot of Somali cooking recipes for us. One of which, this recipe is actually a dish that she makes, I think, at home quite a bit. And it's a simple recipe where she simmers short ribs with soy sauce and cilantro for an extended period of time. And, you know, I followed the recipe as is and remarked at the end of it, like, I rarely use cilantro as a cooking ingredient that simmers for an extended period of time because, you know, it changes the flavor significantly. And it does certainly mute it a little bit, but that also has such a different result that's quite wonderful as well, you know?
Right.
I think that we all have a tendency to almost, it's not necessarily a rut, but perhaps to a fault, follow some of these like cooking rules that we've learned, you know, like the idea of like fresh herbs, like, you know, mint and cilantro and chives have their brightest flavor, just use as a garnish, like don't let it touch the heat at all. But you know, even dried mint has such a different flavor from fresh mint. And I neglected dried mint for such a long time before I was reminded of how different that result is and how much kind of like more complex that flavor can be, especially as it simmers for a long time. So I do think there's a value to occasionally following a recipe and really experiencing something that's different from your practice as a cook.
Totally. Yeah. I never use dried mint and I don't know if I've ever bought it.
Yeah.
But maybe I will. And I also, when you said like cooking cilantro for a while, it's like, it makes sense because you like, you know, put a bunch of parsley stems into your chicken stock or into your braise or whatever.
Totally.
And it's like, why not? I had a thought earlier when you were talking about mise en place and grilled cheese, where I was thinking like, I never make all my mise en place for a meal that I'm cooking at home before I do, because I usually either I'm cooking something that's really simple and I feel like, well, I guess I do, right? If I'm making scrambled eggs, I'm like scrambling the eggs, obviously. But like, you know, I'm wondering like, is it possible to cook like when I think about cooking intuitively, I think about being in the moment and adjust, like making choices as they come and adjusting along the way. And like, I, how, like, I feel like having mise en place ready for a meal you're going to cook intuitively, not following a recipe, would necessitate a lot of front end, like, thinking about what this recipe, like what you're going to cook. I don't know. Do you work that way? Like if you're going to like cook from the hip for like a dinner party, are you like, no, I don't know. I guess a dinner party is different because you like make a shopping list and you like, I don't know.
I still think I'm intuitively like mise en place is now ingrained in my cooking behavior. And the reason why is like even if it's just, oh, what am I going to pull together for dinner? I've looked at what I have. Like
Right.
cooking starts with what do you have, right? So
Right.
intuitively, you've pulled the ingredients that you're going to use. It makes sense to get them ready at that stage. I also like, do you know the character Amelia Bedelia? Like
It is in my brain somewhere, yes, but I don't
Amelia
know.
Bedelia is a silly young lady that I read about in books when I was a kid who certainly doesn't know how to cook, but like I specifically remember a reference of like Amelia Bedelia was told to dress a turkey. And so she puts like a turkey in a dress as opposed to like dressing a turkey or whatnot.
Yeah.
And I feel like I used to read recipes in a similar fashion. Like I had no idea what the purpose of like, why are you making this dough and putting it in the fridge to chill for a few hours? Like there are lots of reasons why it makes sense to do that. You don't want it to like entirely melt when you put it in the oven and then just spread all over.
Right.
You might want to let the gluten relax, et cetera, et cetera. But as a young cook with a certain level of confidence for no reason, with no expertise, like I would say like, oh, I'm not going to set that in the fridge overnight. That's a
Right.
waste of time. And then of course, like the results would not be great. And then even just, when like thinking about like cooking in a restaurant kitchen and you're in the weeds and you're like, oh, everything is going wrong. Like something is being neglected in one pan and something is spilling over in another. Like I think just the value of like really having everything set up before you start cooking just allows you to take the time to pay attention to what's happening in the pan. Is my food darkening too quickly? Do I need to reduce the temperature?
Right.
Do I need to pull it off the heat faster than the recipe says? Like, I think if you are, I really do think the best cooks like have a certain intuition, and it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you're born with. Like you learn to pay attention to a recipe. So, I think having your mise en place ready in the first place allows you to just pay more attention to what's actually happening in your pan, in your pot, in the oven,
Right. That's a good point. I get
which
that.
leads
So
to
it's like,
success. Yeah.
totally, yeah. And so it's like the idea is like, let's say you're cooking something from scratch based on what you have. The idea is like figure out the idea of what you want to make. And then it does take a little bit of like, if you want to cook with your mise en place already done, it takes a little bit of forethought to be like, all right, like I'm going to make a soup. I'm going to cut up, like I know all the vegetables need to be cut up for it. So I'm going to cut those up first.
Yeah,
And then when
yeah.
I start to make my soup, then I can look and be like, all right, which vegetables are going to cook faster? And I don't have to be thinking about that while I'm also cutting the onion.
Right.
Right. Okay. I love that. And then he said something else that I thought was, oh. Yeah. Amelia Bedelia. Like, and your example of you when you were starting being like, I'm not going to rest this dough because I don't know why I would, kind of. And I think there's like a million examples. Like,
So
I think,
foolish. So
no,
foolish.
yeah, but it's like, I think most people, I would imagine, that cook from recipes are following the recipe line by line and putting all their faith in people like you that it's tested and that there's a reason behind everything. And so, and part of me is like, is the recipe as a form, forgive me for saying, like flawed in the ultimate goal of teaching people how to cook because the reasoning behind each step is usually absent from it. Like, do recipes need to change? Like,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go. I think that I think a lot about this because there's so much variance in cooking, right? So like, what do you consider a high temperature or a low temperature or a lot of butter or a little bit of butter, or your stove probably cooks at a slightly different rate than my stove does, or is your oven properly calibrated. And when you think your oven's at 350, is it actually at 325 or is it actually at 375? And that's why I think like recipes should really cover all the bases in terms of having something that is, when you're cooking at each step of a recipe, there's guidance and there's a doneness cue. So the guidance being 5 to 10 minutes, and ideally it's also giving you an intuitive doneness cue, which is until golden brown and caramelized, or until puffed and set in the center. And I think it's really nice that like recipes, I think the best recipes can equally talk to confident cooks who really know their way around the kitchen, but also home cooks, kind of given that instruction that is both very quantifiable and set up for fledgling cooks, but then also intuitive with these doneness cues that tell you what to sense, what to smell, what to look for, what to feel.
Yes, I love that. I totally get that. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm like wondering, like, it's so interesting because there's so many pivot points in a recipe and so many like points, like inflection points, I guess, where you can customize or change based on your taste. And that's one of the things I really love about your recipe, what is it? The substitution guide that you made.
Oh, thanks.
And
yeah.
I think there's a million versions of that where it's like you can almost pull that even farther back. Like the way I think about cooking sometimes, and maybe I should ask you, like when you talked about going to culinary school and learning foundational principles, what does that mean to you? Like when you say foundational cooking principles, like what does that mean to you?
So I'm trying to like step back a little bit further and say that I had worked in food media for years. I'd worked at Rachel Ray for a decent amount of time. I had done restaurant reviews for Time Out New York. I had worked on a few cookbooks. I'd worked in food media for some time, and I decided to go to culinary school. And I decided to go to culinary school not to become a recipe developer or to become a better cook, but really so that I could recognize foundational information. So I could go to a restaurant and eat a dish and say, oh, that's like a pretty classic béarnaise sauce, and what have they done to it? Or kind of identify. In my mind, I went to culinary school to become a more informed food writer. And then I was very surprised because I loved the cooking aspect so much that my career took a different trajectory. But I think that I had wanted to develop, I had had interest in developing recipes before I went to culinary school. And I thought, hey, I'm a pretty good cook. My friends like my cooking. Like, I think I have good ideas. And, I work with many people who are self-taught cooks, and they are so talented and they are so smart and they have incredible palates and incredible expertise. But I think that for me, having the institutional foundational knowledge of cooking just made my recipes and approaches just smarter, more efficient, more logical, and just yielded better results. And what I mean by that is the idea of like, I don't know, figuring out a really solid way to roast a chicken, like if you haven't kind of mastered these like kind of basic foundational elements, you're figuring it out yourself, which is great and wonderful, but you're missing out on the expertise and mistakes and learned better ways to do things from your predecessors, if that makes sense.
Totally. Can you pull apart the foundational knowledge of like, if roast chicken is an easy example for you, like what are the foundational like things, like are you talking about like the idea of roasting in general, or like the idea of salting a chicken in advance, or
I mean all of those things, right? Like if you have not actively, and I really don't think that you have to go to culinary school by any means to be a good cook or to be a recipe developer. That is absolutely not a necessity. I think that you can learn that from reading a ton of cookbooks. You can learn that from reading recipes. You can learn that from cooking a ton of different things, working in a kitchen, working in a test kitchen, a bunch of other places. Like that foundational knowledge doesn't necessarily have to just come from culinary school. It comes from the practice of cooking and reading and learning. And if you haven't done that for an extended period of time, you might have wonderful ideas, but your wonderful ideas will be better executed with more practice, if that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, that was a huge question I have for you. And I think like kind of a question I have in my life and like in this podcast is how, I guess like I think about this in a similar way to, it sounds like you think about it, which is like cooking. One way of thinking about cooking is applying a bunch of principles, to ingredients to make the thing that you want to make. Mm-hmm. And so when I think about like a braise, for example, like I think it's like, for me, it's been helpful to think about like a braise is a technique that when applied to different flavors and ingredients can make a bunch of different things. So like, braised Moroccan chicken is like the same principle as like, French braised chicken and red wine and tomato or whatever. Mm-hmm. And, I guess a question I have is like, a question I've had for a while is like, what's the best way to teach people that? Because I think a lot of food media, in my experience, isn't like so focused on that. Partially, I think because it's not so practical, and like people, like most people aren't trying to learn a new creative skill when they cook. They're trying to like make food to eat. Mm-hmm. But I also feel like that knowledge is what makes cooking fun, easier to customize for yourself, and like. So my question has always been like, how do you teach people those things if it's not readily available in the recipe they're using, if they don't have time or interest in going to cooking school or cooking in a restaurant, like, how do you teach people that? How do people become an intuitive cook? Is it like a practice where like you kind of just have to be like, pay attention to what you cook every time you cook and try to like think about it a little bit, or like, does someone have to take it up as like a real serious hobby? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
I think the question of how do you teach someone to become an intuitive cook, I think that I don't. So if you're to think about like what is the opposite of an intuitive cook, like you have an intuitive cook, mm-hmm. and then I guess in my mind the opposite of an intuitive cook would be like a recipe addict, right? Like someone who like is like looking at the recipe, like cannot think about a substitution because that's not what the recipe says. That's not what the recipe is telling me to do. The recipe says 7 minutes. It says it's supposed to be brown in this time. It's not browned yet, but the recipe says 7 minutes, so I'm going to pull it off the heat, And I think that I don't actually think that the recipe addicts are all people who don't have experience cooking, and that the intuitive cooks are people who have experience cooking. That may be the case, in a lot of examples, but I think it comes down to how did you learn how to cook? Like, I have friends who don't necessarily know much about cooking, but they learned to cook intuitively, meaning like, oh, here's how, I'm putting a pork tenderloin in the oven, and I've coated it with a little bit of fat, and I've seasoned it with a little bit of spices, and I'm going to cook it until it's browned on the outside, and I'm going to insert a meat thermometer and make sure it's this temperature. And then I'm going to slice it and serve it. And I think I do actually think that people who are taught to cook or learn how to cook without very granularly relying upon recipes generally have a little bit more confidence and a little bit better understanding of cooking, mostly by following doneness cues, which is based on intuition, right? And observation. And I think that I fought very hard to move past my recipe addict approach to cooking of my early years, and that took just a lot of building knowledge and practice, and I think gaining the confidence to have creativity in the kitchen.
Yeah. Well, let's zoom in on that a little bit, because like I have friends in my life that are also recipe addicts, which I think is a new term here, and hopefully that's okay to use. Yeah. Like how did you, or how does someone like move out of recipe reliance? Like I know people in my life that like like I was just at someone's house yesterday and they're making cinnamon rolls from the pack where that explodes
Mm-hmm.
and it's all scary, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And
Hmm.
they put it in and they're like 5 minutes in, they're like, oh shit, I forgot a timer.
Yeah.
You know, like how am I going to know that
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
done,
Yeah.
you know? And so
Yeah.
it's like how do you get those people without like sitting them down and being like, I don't know, how do you get those people to move away from recipes, I guess is my question.
I mean, I think the reality is cooking is a lot more fun when you are I feel like it's a lot more fun when you're really just paying attention to the food as opposed to like putting your finger on a piece of paper and looking like how many milliliters am I supposed to use for this? And I think I don't know, I think the advice is like just pay attention to what's happening in front of you and then it just becomes you can recognize um, you can recognize getting the results that you want in cooking the food the way you should be doing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I think the terrifying truth might be that one of the secrets to being good at cooking is being able to be very present in the present moment, which I think is
Yeah.
like, like being able to like take something out and being like, what is this looking like, what is this looking like? What do I want it to look like? What has what I've done so far done to this? Like, what have I
Hmm.
done?
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm. Hmm.
I think a really big part of it is being present and observing, and then
As I
like,
try to get rid of my cat, sorry.
right? No, totally. I mean, it seems to be the truth, about that way for so many different things, but like, there's some, I think, yeah, I don't know. It seems like maybe being present is a big part of it. But then there's also like these foundational principles that you're talking about, I think are really important because and I think we should go back to grilled cheese because I'm imagining someone at home that like put this on and is like, I'm gonna make a grilled cheese along to this, and all they've got is oil and butter, and like they're in their band, being like, what the fuck's going on? But like balancing heat, like on one way to think about balancing heat is like that is like a culinary like a principle, like
Hmm.
it becomes relevant when you're deep frying something and
Hmm.
you want to have it at 350 or 375 so that the coating on your chicken cooks at the same time as the inside of the, like that
Hmm.
is a similar principle and it can be applied to so many different things. But in another world, there's a way simpler way to look at it, which is just like, I've got something in the pan, part of it seems to be burning and the other part seems to not be cooking, and like,
Hmm.
how do I fix that?
Hmm.
And so a logical person that could, maybe this is wrong, but I think like someone that was logical could probably abstract themselves in that moment and be like, okay, this is crazy, nobody would ever think this way, but like, okay, the heat is going up right now, but what I
Hmm.
need is for the heat to be like here all around, so I'm going to put a lid on it. And
Hmm.
so that's kind of the reason why you end up putting a lid on it, I imagine. Or like the direct heat is coming from below, and so that needs to go down. You know what I mean? You know kind of what I'm saying? Or maybe
Yeah.
I'm being very
No,
confusing,
no.
but it's like
No, I
there's
get it, but that is the combination of um experience and practice and trying things out,
yeah.
like um yeah, I think so much of cooking is about trying things out, and like I think that's one thing that I always find really exciting about the grind of like weeknight cooking and like having to feed yourself food I don't know 14 to 21 times a week, right?
Right.
Like figuring out I think for me, I get really excited about like I still get excited about like every meal that I'm cooking for the most part, like
Mm.
truly. Just the idea of like, well, even if my dish didn't turn out great, like I'm not going to do it that way next time. I'm going to try this next time. And like
Mm.
I think despite the fact that cooking can be exhausting and it can be a daily chore and it can be overwhelming, I always just get really excited about every meal is like still the potential for something really great, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know. I get excited about that.
Do you feel like there was any like breakthrough? Like, I feel like we've talked a little bit through this episode about like, lessons you've learned, like the use of water in like a creamy pasta to bring it back to life.
Hmm.
And like all these like tips, and can you remember any like breakthrough moments in your journey to become a more intuitive cook where you kind of like had a revelation and you were like, oh, like I kind of get this one thing, or like I get how things are connected. Like maybe it might be too abstract, but do any like,
I think that immediately makes me think about um, a breakthrough moment for me was learning not to accept the rules that I'd been told.
Mm.
right? So for example, my mom told me when I was a kid, like her secret to why her cooking was so good was because she wasn't afraid of butter and she'd always add extra butter and extra garlic. And like I did that for a very long time, and extra butter and extra garlic is really delicious. But when I started cooking a significant amount of vegan food in my 20s and exploring like a vegan diet more, it was quite eye-opening to me to realize like you don't need fat to add richness. Like it can be added in so many different ways. You can, blend nuts to do that. You can blend tofu to do that. You can blend vegetables to thicken things. And like, so I don't know. I feel like this is an annoying answer that's a non-answer, but I think when you get to a point in cooking that you kind of can question things and think about them differently, I think that's the point at which you can really grow as a cook.
Mm. Cool. I love that. I guess maybe a last like general question is like, if you had one piece of advice for someone that wanted to get better at cooking, what would it be?
Uh, I mean, cook more is maybe too simple. I don't know. I think it really does come down to practice. Like the confidence and expertise really all come from practice. And it doesn't have to be cooking all the time. That is expensive. We can only eat so much. Cooking, reading, trying new things, making mistakes. Like making mistakes is such a great way to learn as a cook. And just the optimism of like your next meal. I think that sounds very cheesy, but you can always do better next time.
Damn. Okay. Well, this has been amazing. I really, really, really appreciate you taking the time. It's like, I honestly feel like I could talk to you for hours, and we have a little bit. Thank you so much. This has been like such a pleasure for me.
That was so fun. I'm
Yay.
excited to hear more of your voice and your thoughts on cooking with your podcast.
Yay! Thank you for listening to the first episode of To Taste. I'm so happy to have you here. Now I'm going to do the credits, which I'm going to try to remember off the top of my dome. I interviewed and edited and recorded all this stuff. Can you tell? And our art and logo was done by the wonderful Ben Pacelli. And our music was done by Justin Kohlberg of Moonrun. He's amazing. And he also helped me figure out how to edit this, which is cool. I also want to give a shout out to Simon Lidstead for his help and Sam Anderson as well for advice. And I guess basically every loved one in my life for listening to me talk about this idea and stuff, I guess. I've recorded 10 more of these, so there's going to be a lot more soon. And you can, I think at first I'm probably going to release them every 2 weeks until I figure out how exactly to edit quickly, at which point I'll start releasing them every week. So don't hold me to that. Okay, bye-bye.